At 02:18 on the morning of April 5, 1943, the USS O'Bannon DD-450 was cutting through the black waters of the Solomon Sea at 25 knots. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer, the workhorse of the U.S. Navy. Displacing 2,050 tons, powered by General Electric geared steam turbines generating 60,000 shaft horsepower, she was a predator designed for speed and violence. Her commanding officer was Commander Donald MacDonald, a man known for his aggression and tactical sharp-mindedness. The O'Bannon was returning from a bombardment mission against Japanese shore installations on Kalimanjaro. The crew was exhausted. They had been at general quarters for hours. The smell of cordite from the 5-inch guns still hung in the humid tropical air. The ship was running darkened ship, no lights, no cigarettes, total silence. They were transiting the slot, the dangerous narrow channel between the islands where the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the night. At 02:20, the SG surface search radar operator called out a contact, skunk bearing 210, range 7,000 yards. Commander MacDonald stepped onto the bridge wing. He raised his binoculars. The night was pitch black with heavy cloud cover blocking the moon. He couldn't see anything yet, but the radar trace was solid. It was moving slowly on the surface. "Bring her right to course 220, MacDonald ordered. "Prepare to ram." The O'Bannon heeled over as the helmsman spun the wheel. The destroyers of the Pacific Fleet had a standing order: if you see a submarine on the surface, you do not wait for a depth charge run, you run it over, you slice the pressure hull in half with your steel bow. At 02:25, the range closed to 1,000 yards. The lookout shouted, "Visual." Submarine off the starboard bow. It was a Japanese Row 34, a Kaichu-type coastal submarine. It was large, 240 feet long, displacing 1,000 tons. It was cruising on the surface, recharging its batteries with its diesel engines. The Japanese lookouts were asleep or negligent. They hadn't seen the American destroyer rushing at them out of the darkness at 30 miles per hour. MacDonald gripped the railing. He was lined up for a perfect collision. He was going to cut the sub in two. But at 02:26, with 30 seconds to impact, a thought struck MacDonald. This was a large submarine. It was sitting very low in the water. Intelligence reports from the previous week indicated that the Japanese were using large mine-laying submarines in this sector. If the Row 34 was a mine layer and MacDonald rammed it, the collision would detonate the sea mines stored in the submarine's hull. The explosion wouldn't just kill the sub, it would vaporize the O'Bannon. "Hard left rudder," MacDonald screamed. "Emergency back full." The order saved the ship from an explosion, but it created a tactical nightmare. The O'Bannon shuddered as the propellers reversed. The bow swung hard to port. Instead of slicing through the submarine, the destroyer drifted alongside it. The two vessels settled parallel to each other. They were so close that the paint on the O'Bannon's hull almost scraped the rust on the Row 34. The distance was less than 10 yards. They were dead in the water, side by side in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This proximity created a physics problem that neither captain had anticipated. The O'Bannon carried 5 5-inch Mark 30 dual-purpose guns. These were massive weapons capable of destroying a battleship, but they had a depression limit. They could not aim lower than a certain angle because the ship's own railings and deck housing were in the way. MacDonald shouted, "Fire main battery." The gunnery officer replied, "Target is too close, we can't depress." The massive guns swung out, but their barrels were pointing over the submarine, aiming at the empty ocean beyond. The O'Bannon was effectively disarmed by its own size. At 02:28, the Japanese crew woke up. The submarine's conning tower hatch flew open. The Japanese sailors began pouring out onto the wet deck. They were shouting, confused and terrified. They ran toward their own weapon, a 3-inch 76 deck gun mounted forward of the tower. If the Japanese manned that gun, they wouldn't need to aim. They were point-blank range. A single 3-inch shell fired into the O'Bannon's waterline or magazine would detonate the destroyer's ammunition and sink her. Furthermore, the Japanese sailors were carrying Type 99 hand grenades and Nambu pistols. They were preparing to board the American ship or toss explosives onto the deck. The American sailors on the starboard deck of the O'Bannon were defenseless. They were deckhands, cooks, and supply clerks. They didn't have rifles. The ship's armory was locked. The 20 Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns were positioned too high to fire down at this angle. They were standing 10 feet away from the enemy, staring them in the face with nothing to fight with. Then a sailor named Adamson looked down. Stored in a wire bin lashed to the deck railing was the ship's supply of fresh vegetables. Specifically, sacks of potatoes, Idaho russets, hard, brown, and heavy. Adamson grabbed a potato. It felt like a rock. In the darkness, it felt like a weapon. "Throw them," he yelled. "Throw the spuds." The American sailors dove into the bin. They grabbed handfuls of potatoes. At 02:29, the strangest firefight in naval history began. The Americans began hurling potatoes at the Japanese sailors on the submarine deck below. To the Japanese sailors in the pitch-black darkness, these objects were not vegetables. They saw dark, round, heavy objects flying through the air, hitting the steel deck with a metallic thud. They looked like Mark II fragmentation grenades. Panic erupted on the deck of the Row 34. A Japanese officer screamed, "Grenades, take cover." The Japanese sailors, who were seconds away from manning the deck gun, abandoned their weapon. They dove for the conning tower hatch. They kicked the grenades overboard. They scrambled over each other to get away from the American vegetables. One Japanese sailor tried to pick up a potato to throw it back, realized it didn't have a pin, froze in confusion, and was hit in the face by another potato. The Americans kept throwing. They emptied the bin. They threw hundreds of potatoes. They created a barrage of starch that suppressed a heavily armed naval vessel. For 2 critical minutes, the potato barrage kept the Japanese away from their 3-inch gun. Those 2 minutes gave Commander MacDonald exactly what he needed: time. "Right full rudder," MacDonald ordered. "All ahead flank," the O'Bannon's turbines screamed. The water churned at the stern. The destroyer began to pull away, opening the distance. As the ship surged forward, the gap widened: 50 yards, 100 yards, 200 yards. The Japanese sailors on the sub realized the grenades weren't exploding. They ran back to their deck gun. They started to rotate it, but it was too late. The O'Bannon was now at the perfect range. If you want to know how the potato ship finished the job with actual high explosives, please hit that like button. It helps us share these bizarre but true stories, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the battle. At 02:32, the range was 400 yards. MacDonald spoke into the voice tube. "All guns, fire." The O'Bannon's 3 after turrets unleashed a salvo of 5-inch shells. The first shell struck the Row 34 directly at the base of the conning tower. The explosion blew the Japanese gun crew into the sea. The submarine rolled violently to starboard. The O'Bannon didn't stop. She circled the wounded shark. The Japanese captain of Row 34 initiated a crash dive. The submarine began to slip beneath the waves, trailing oil and smoke. MacDonald wasn't going to let them escape. "Prepare depth charges, medium pattern." The O'Bannon raced over the swirl of water where the submarine had disappeared. The K guns on the side fired. The racks on the stern dropped the heavy canisters. Depth charges are not precision weapons. They are sledgehammers. They are filled with Torpex explosive. They are set to detonate at specific depths by hydrostatic pressure. The pattern bracketed the diving submarine. The ocean floor shook. A massive geyser of water erupted behind the O'Bannon. Then silence. The crew waited. They watched the sonar. At 02:40, the evidence floated to the surface. It wasn't just oil, it was debris, wood from the interior, clothing, and floating amidst the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy warship were dozens of American potatoes. The Row 34 was gone. It had been sunk by a combination of high-tech sonar, heavy artillery, and a wire bin of root vegetables. When the USS O'Bannon returned to port at Naumea after the patrol, the story of the potato incident began to spread. At first, the admirals didn't believe it. The combat report stated that the destroyer had sunk a Japanese submarine using depth charges and gunfire. But in the remarks section, the crew had added the detail about the vegetables. The story leaked to the press. The American public, hungry for any good news from the Pacific, went wild. The headline "American Destroyer Sinks Jap Sub with Potatoes" ran in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The Potato Growers Association of Maine sent a telegram to the ship. They offered to buy the crew a drink. They sent a commemorative plaque to be mounted on the ship's mess deck. It read, "To the officers and men of the USS O'Bannon who proved that American ingenuity and potatoes can defeat any enemy." But the O'Bannon wasn't just a joke. It was one of the most lethal ships in the U.S. Navy. The potato incident was just one chapter in a career that defied probability. The crew called her the Lucky O. She fought in almost every major naval engagement of the Pacific War. She fought at Guadalcanal, she fought at Kula Gulf, she fought at Vela La Vela. At the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 13, 1942, one of the most brutal surface battles in history, the O'Bannon engaged the Japanese battleship Hiei. The Hiei was a 36,000-ton monster with 14-inch guns. The O'Bannon was a 2,000-ton tin can. Commander MacDonald took the ship so close to the battleship that the Japanese heavy guns couldn't depress low enough to hit him, a tactic he would later inadvertently repeat with the submarine. The O'Bannon raked the battleship's superstructure with 5-inch fire, blinding it and setting it on fire, allowing American torpedo planes to finish it off the next day. Through all of this, through kamikaze attacks, typhoons, and point-blank gun battles, the O'Bannon developed a reputation for being untouchable. Other ships in her squadron were sunk. The USS Atlanta was lost. The USS Juneau was lost, but the O'Bannon kept sailing. By the end of World War II, the O'Bannon had earned 17 battle stars. She was the most decorated destroyer in the Pacific Fleet. She had fired more rounds, steamed more miles, and engaged more enemies than almost any other ship. But the most incredible statistic of the USS O'Bannon is not the number of ships she sank. It is the number of men she lost. 0. In 3 years of continuous combat from 1942 to 1945, facing battleships, submarines, and aircraft, the USS O'Bannon never lost a single sailor to enemy fire. Not one Purple Heart was awarded for a combat death on board. She was the Mary Celestia of the Pacific, a ship that seemed protected by a force field, or perhaps by the spirit of the potato. After the war, the O'Bannon was decommissioned, then recommissioned for the Korean War. She bombarded shore batteries and screened aircraft carriers. She served again in the Vietnam War, patrolling the coast and providing gunfire support. She was an old lady by then, her hull tired, her engines worn, but she still had the plaque from the Potato Growers Association in the mess hall. She was finally decommissioned for the last time on January 30, 1970. She was sold for scrap heavily. It was an ignoble end for a warrior. She was towed to a scrapyard and cut into razor blades. The steel that had faced down the battleship Hiei and the submarine Row 34 was melted down and recycled. But the legend remains. The story of the O'Bannon is taught in naval history classes not just as a funny anecdote, but as a lesson in quick thinking. Commander MacDonald and Seaman Adamson proved that in the chaos of war, the best weapon isn't always the biggest gun. Sometimes it's the thing nearest to your hand. Sometimes it's a vegetable. The Japanese captain of the Row 34 went to his death believing he was under attack by advanced American fragmentation grenades. He never knew he was defeated by a side dish. And somewhere in the archives of the U.S. Navy, there is a supply requisition form from April 1943 that lists the ammunition expended during the battle. 5-inch shells, 12. Depth charges, 4. Potatoes, 50 pounds. If this story made you laugh, please hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing the wildest stories from the archives every single day. Drop a comment right now and tell us, what is the strangest weapon you've ever heard of in a war? A potato, a bow and arrow? Let us know. Thank you for watching and thank you for remembering the lucky O.